and international lakes. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'll just run you through quickly what our session is. So we're going to have firstly a presentation by Ms. Sonia Koppel, Secretary of the Water Convention. We're then going into a panel session with Ms. Tanja Miškova, Ambassador in charge of Water Diplomacy and Circular Economy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Slovenia. We will then have a video from Nyandu Munkaila, Technical Director of the Niger Basin Authority. We'll then have Suzanne Schmeier, Associate Professor of Water Law and Diplomacy, IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. We'll then have Lenka Tamay, Executive Secretary from the Orange Senku Basin Commission. We'll then have Susan Daniel, Secretary for the US Section for the International Joint Commission. And we'll then have Bradley Mogridge, Associate Professor, University of Canberra. We'll then have a question and answer session. So we very much encourage questions from the audience here in person, but we'll also be monitoring online for some questions from the online audience. With that, I would throw to Sonia for her initial presentation. Sonia.
Thank you very much and good morning. It's a pleasure to see such a full room. And actually I would like to start by asking a few questions and ask you to raise your hand. Who of you is working on Transboundary Water Cooperation? Okay, good. It's almost half of the room. That's very, very good. And who is working on national water management? Okay, very good. And also we can see that some are working on both Transboundary and national water management. And who is working more on the civil society, research, academia perspective, NGO? Very good. Great. And international organizations? Also some. Very good. Who of you knows about the Water Convention? Okay, at least 1/3 of room. So that's a good basis. So the Water Convention, as those of you, some of you know already, is unique legal and institutional framework for transboundary water cooperation at the now global level, contributing to sustainable development, international peace and security. Because as probably most of you know, we have more than 300 shared rivers around the world and almost 600 shared aquifers. And that means transboundary water cooperation is crucial for peace, sustainable development, climate action, etc. And that's why we need a platform in the United Nations system where countries and organizations and other partners can discuss and jointly advance transboundary water cooperation. So in the framework of the Water Convention, more than 130 countries come together with other partners and organizations to exchange experience and knowledge and advance cooperation at a global level. And much of the work of the Water Convention is based on its institutional mechanism. So we have the meeting of the parties at its top, which brings together ministers and other government officials, and which has met last time in September last year in Geneva and online. Then we have working groups on integrated water resource management and monitoring and assessment. We have task forces on different topics such as water and climate, such as the Nexus and industrial accidents. We have an implementation committee which helps countries to implement the Water Convention and address and resolve disputes, and the Bureau, and we have the Secretariat of the Water Convention, which I am currently heading. So the Water Convention carries out most of its work through the program of work, which covers all or many different challenges associated with transboundary water cooperation. So, for example, monitoring and assessment transboundary waters, financing transboundary water cooperation, managing water in an integrated intersectoral way. And in these different areas, activities are carried out at global, regional, basin and national level. And they include pilot projects, guidance, exchange of experience, capacity development, and policy advice activities. So here you can see, the map is a bit, unfortunately, not very well shown here, that while the Water Convention has been globalized a few years ago, And activities are already happening now, obviously in the Pan-European region, but also in Africa, and some also in Latin America. And I will focus a bit more now on some of the tools of the Water Convention, which help countries to address some of the biggest challenges, such as how to share waters between countries, how to develop agreements, how to finance transboundary water cooperation. You can see some of those tools here, which cover flood management, disaster risk reduction, development of joint bodies, etc. So I will talk a bit more about some of the most recent tools which were adopted or presented at the meeting of the parties in September last year. So one challenge is how to develop agreements between countries. So in this regard has been developed by a drafting group or a practical guide on the development of legal frameworks for transboundary water cooperation, which aims at supporting countries in the design and drafting of such agreements. And it basically presents different building blocks which countries can consider when developing agreements, and also presents examples from agreements from around the world in order to give inspiration to those working on legal frameworks at the basin level. Another increasing challenge is how to share waters, how to allocate waters between different users at national level, and even more difficult at transboundary level. And with increasing climate change impacts, this topic becomes more and more acute. But history shows that transboundary water allocation agreements can work for the benefits of states involved if they are well designed, jointly agreed, adaptable, and this is one of the most important but also most challenging issues, and effectively implemented. So this topic has been addressed through an expert group set up under the Water Convention in the last 3 years, which has prepared a handbook on water allocation in the transboundary context, and basically which is a compendium with providing an overview of water allocation agreements from around the world. There's many examples, some of which will be presented here today. And after the adoption last year by the meeting of the parties, this handbook will now be popularized, promoted in capacity building events, and also through a shorter publication. So here you can see some of the main messages of the Transboundary Water Allocation Handbook, which I don't really have much time now to go into. But as I said, for example, one most important message is that transboundary water allocation agreements should be adaptable, and that transboundary water allocation also has to be seen as one approach together with many other approaches for transboundary water cooperation, such as the nexus approach. And this is also what we are going to discuss here today. So the Water Convention has actually also been working on this topic of water, food, energy, ecosystem nexus, helping countries to identify intersectoral synergies, to identify policy measures and action that can help alleviate tensions, and thereby to optimize their use of the resources. So a number of intersectoral assessments have been carried out in several basins around the world, including in Central Asia, Caucasus region, or North Africa region. And the synthesis publication on this experience has been prepared and presented also last year at the meeting of the parties. Then we have already been working on climate change since 2006 through a task force on water and climate. And the climate change area is a very nice example of how we work under the Water Convention, because not only we prepare guidance material, but also then afterwards there's a process for exchanging experience through global workshops, through pilot projects on the ground in order to apply those guidance material, and then to feed back the lessons learned into global policy processes such as the COP, UNFCCC, etc. And finally, I already mentioned how to finance transboundary water cooperation is certainly a big challenge for countries around the world. And that's why this topic has been also come into focus of the Water Convention over the last years. So together with several IFIs and countries, we have not only organized workshops on this topic, but developed a publication on funding and financing of transboundary water cooperation and basin development, which presents on the one hand needs, but most importantly sources, and also some lessons learned for financing transboundary water cooperation, such as that member state contributions are and should be the primary funding source, especially for the core costs of basin organization, but that there are also some innovative financing instruments under development, and private funding and financing can be leveraged as additional opportunities, especially for infrastructure development costs. So I cannot now go into more detail, but I invite you all to consult our website. We have brought a few copies, but I think most of them hard copies, but most of them are already gone. And but please have a look at our website or approach us. We can also send some of the publication. And now in the upcoming panel, we will hear some practical examples from different parts of the world, including some of which have contributed to those guidance materials. And we will also hear how some of them have maybe applied some of those tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and also Remy. And it's great to see that we have a full room and hopefully also several thousands online. And I hope you all hear very well. We have a panel with 5 colleagues who were already introduced, and we probably use around to get through a couple of questions together with everyone. And let's keep the time in a way that answers are something between 2 to 3 minutes, so that at the end we can have open discussions from the floor. So while you listen, make some notes, think about questions you would like to pose for the colleagues. And I think really trying to capture the essence of the topic, that what is the value of transboundary water cooperation, and probably also thinking about these different tools and approaches presented by Sonia. And we'll see them in cases as well. I maybe forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Antti Rautavaara. I come from the Finnish Foreign Ministry. And as you may know, the convention comes with the nickname of Helsinki Convention or Helsinki Water Convention. So there is a lot of background with Finland to be working together with the Secretariat and all the partners in the convention. But I think we start with Tanja, with you. And the first question for you is that how has transboundary cooperation fared so far in the preparatory process for the 23 UN Water Conference? What would it take to consider the conference a success in terms of promoting transboundary water cooperation? Tanja.
Thank you, Antti. Well, I think many of you have attended some of the preparatory meetings for the 2023 conference, and me having attended quite a few of them, I can attest to the fact that transboundary water cooperation was taken up as something that is instrumental for sustainable development, for environmental protection, for climate action and peace and security by many countries and other stakeholders. And also during the consultations for the themes of the interactive dialogues for the 2023 conference, the transboundary water cooperation came up as one of the topics and one of the themes that should be discussed in 2023. So let's hope it is on the agenda. And what would then qualify as a success? Number one, I think, would be a number of countries announcing their commitment to engage in any kind of cross-border water cooperation. But I think particularly I would be happy to see new engagement on transboundary aquifers. We heard how many aquifers we have. I think there are only 7 with transboundary agreements. Announcements to join one or both UN water conventions, or at least engage in the accession process. The second, of course, besides showcasing concrete achievements and examples of different forms of cooperation, be it formal, informal, national, subnational level, also commitments to take the existing transboundary water cooperation to a higher level. And I think upstream countries with successful cooperation like mine, like Slovenia, we have an additional responsibility in that. And I also hope that some kind of a coalition that would work to promote transboundary water cooperation would be announced in New York. The third, I would like to see announcements of initiatives on accelerating science and innovation and digital transformation to enable water information systems that offer opportunities for more neutral, reliable data and transparent data and information sharing. The fourth, I would expect from international organizations and donors to commit to more funding for transboundary water cooperation, so developing joint regional vision, strategic planning, supported by regional programming, and for example, the EU is doing exactly this in Africa and Central Asia. And of course, developing also regional basin-wide capacity building programs. The fifth, river basin organizations announcing strategies or action plans on gender and youth empowerment in their decision-making processes. Later today, Women in Water Diplomacy Global Network will present their global strategy and there are some really great recommendations there. And finally, my last expectation would be announcements of commitments for better protection of water resources and infrastructure before, during, and after armed conflicts. So a significant move towards a universal acceptance of water, peace, and security nexus would be something I would very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And you are a senior, very experienced Slovenian diplomat. So what is driving Slovenia in the engagement in water diplomacy and transboundary water cooperation, and if there are any lessons learned from Slovenian experience?
Yeah, I come from a region which experienced a very bloody conflict in the 90s in the Western Balkans. So my country was instrumental in securing the first regional agreement after the war, which was on the Sava River Basin. So we had a water agreement paved the way, build the trust for other forms of cooperation that developed later. So seeing firsthand how water can be a real catalyst for peace and security, then we took it upon us to further promote the water and peace nexus and transboundary water cooperation. So what lessons have we learned? Sonia has already mentioned on what really is a kind of prerequisite for functioning transboundary cooperation. I would just add that initial trust can be built through technical cooperation on non-conflictual issues, and in our case, it was navigation. Then, of course, you need effective governance mechanism, preferably in the form of river basin organizations, grounded in relevant legal instruments. And we heard how really fantastic instrument the Water Convention is, and the Helsinki Water Convention is. And for example, when we concluded our bilateral agreement on our transboundary aquifer with Austria, we modeled it on the Helsinki Water Convention. Sonia mentioned contemporary and flexible management, which is very important to adapt to things like climate change or to integrate the nexus approach, and we've done that as well. Very important an inclusive multi-stakeholder approach, not just other sectors and academia and NGOs, but I'm mostly talking about women and youth. And in our case, we have a very lively youth parliament in the Sava River Basin. Sonia mentioned sustainable financing by the countries themselves, and I can attest to that. And joint river basin planning and efficient coordination of national plans. There's another good practice I wish to mention, which is proclaiming transboundary nature reserves. We have the first UNESCO 5-country biosphere reserve of the Mura, Drava River, Danube rivers among Austria, Croatia, Hungary, Serbia, and Slovenia, and has been recognized as an international model for regional cooperation. And on a final note, each transboundary basin is highly specific. National leaders will always put immediate development or political strategic needs first. So we need to build a case for transboundary water cooperation by placing it within a specific, distinctive economic, political, or strategic context and identify adequate entry points accordingly. So when, let's say, relations within a basin are to contentions, maybe wider regional approach may be more efficient. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And I think it's a great news that we have the interactive dialogue in the UN conference as we speak, framed as one of the dialogues, dialogue number 4. But let's move to you, Susan. So We first have a short video on the Niger Basin Authority, and then we have a question for you. Or we have more questions for you.
Mesdames et messieurs, au nom de l'autorité du bassin du Niger, il est pour moi un réel plaisir de m'adresser à vous à l'occasion de cet important événement. Il faut noter que face aux multiples défis liés à sa mission, l'autorité du bassin du Niger s'est dotée d'importants dispositifs institutionnels, organisationnels et programmatiques qui sont en train de s'adapter aux idéaux d'un développement intégré et durable de son bassin. Par-dessus tout, il y a une politique de développement nommée la vision partagée, adoptée depuis 2004, et un instrument de mise en œuvre qui est la charte de l'eau de l'ABN elle-même adoptée depuis 2008 par l'ensemble des États et sur lesquels tous les projets et programmes d'investissement dans le bassin doivent s'aligner. Pour cela, depuis 2007, nous avons élaboré notre schéma d'aménagement et de gestion des projets et programmes, traduisant la vision partagée au moyen de 350 actions ou fiches de projets identifiées dans l'ensemble du bassin. Ce plan d'action de développement durable a été traduit en plan stratégique sur la période 2013-2024, décliné en un plan opérationnel sur la période 2016-2024, lequel est assorti d'un plan d'investissement climat comportant 246 actions. Au fur et à mesure de la mise en œuvre de nos activités, les dispositions de la charte de l'eau sont précisées et complétées par des annexes actuellement au nombre de 5, portant sur des thématiques spécifiques, dont la dernière en date sur le statut juridique des ouvrages communs et ouvrages d'intérêt commun. Aussi, à travers l'opérationnalisation de notre observatoire du bassin du Niger, nous avons mis en place un système efficace de collecte, de traitement, d'analyse et de diffusion de données hydrologiques et hydroclimatiques à l'échelle de l'ensemble du bassin du Niger. Pour couronner tout ce dispositif et accélérer la mise en œuvre et l'atteinte des objectifs de nos projets et programmes d'investissement, nous élaborons actuellement des lignes directrices pour l'intégration de l'approche Nexus eau, énergie et sécurité alimentaire pour promouvoir la durabilité environnementale dans le développement de nos futurs projets et programmes d'investissement. L'objectif de cette initiative est de renforcer les synergies intersectorielles et réduire les antagonismes dans les programmes et projets d'investissement dans le bassin sur des bases durables à l'échelle de l'ensemble du bassin du Niger. Nous sommes du reste convaincus que l'approche Nexus permettra d'accroître la collaboration entre acteurs et de promouvoir le partage des bénéfices entre les États et avec les communautés locales et accélérer l'atteinte des objectifs de développement intégré et durable du bassin. S'agissant de la question des conflits dans le bassin du Niger, il convient tout d'abord de noter que la variabilité et le changement climatique sont des obstacles majeurs au développement dans le bassin du Niger, vaste de plus de 1 500 000 km² de superficie active et qui abrite une population d'environ 160 millions d'habitants répartis dans les 9 pays membres et dont 70% vivent dans des zones où la sécurité hydrique et la sécurité alimentaire dépendent des précipitations annuelles. Cette situation et son corollaire de tendance à la dégradation des écosystèmes et d'aménagement des ressources naturelles créent du coup des antagonismes que nous parvenons heureusement à surmonter grâce aux dispositifs que nous avons su mettre en place, notamment à travers la charte de l'eau de l'ABN. Dans ce domaine précis de conflit, nous sommes également en train de mesurer toute la portée et l'impact de ces phénomènes sur la disponibilité des ressources naturelles et dans quelle mesure cela pourra exacerber les conflits locaux existants dans le cadre du projet Frexus en développant d'une part des outils de diagnostic local et régional des conflits et d'autre part des approches de mitigation directement avec les divers groupes d'usagers. En tout état de cause, en rapport avec le rôle de l'ABN en tant que promoteur de paix, notre objectif consiste à continuer à prévenir les potentiels conflits autour des ressources naturelles du bassin. En l'occurrence, dans un contexte où de plus en plus de défis et de rivalités apparaissent et où s'aggravent autour de l'accès aux dites ressources naturelles. Pour terminer, je voudrais réitérer nos sincères remerciements et toute notre gratitude aux organisateurs de cette importante session et à nos partenaires techniques et financiers pour les appuis multiformes qu'ils apportent à l'autorité du bassin du Niger dans la mise en œuvre de sa politique de développement. Vive la coopération internationale, vive l'autorité du bassin du Niger. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
So, thanks on that presentation, and we heard the Niger basin, was it 9 countries and millions of people also being reliant on the rainfalls for water security and food security. So Susanna, for you, we asked that is the situation in Lake Chad with regards to water and conflict similar to Niger river basin, and what are the challenges there?
Yes, thanks, Antti, for the question. Let me maybe just say very briefly why I'm speaking about that. One, because Nyandu unfortunately couldn't be here, but also because the Autorité du Bassin du Niger, together with GIZ and IHE and the Water Peace and Security Partnership, work in this, what he mentioned, Frexus project. And to maybe reveal what this horrible terms means, it's a construction of the water, energy, food, ecosystem nexus in fragile countries, which gives you Frexus. So that maybe just as a background for everyone. And this project works indeed in the Niger Basin and also in Lake Chad, where we have quite similar conditions, right? It's a region that is struggling with water scarcity, that's highly affected by climate change already today, and that's a region that has seen conflict emerging out of these water-related threats, namely drought and variability. So in Lake Chad, we have, similar to the Niger Basin, the challenge that changes and reductions in water availability affect people's livelihoods and lead to competition and sometimes conflict, sometimes even violent conflict between the different users, mainly between farmers and herders and to some extent fishermen, but also between different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different communities, and on top of that also indirect conflict effects, such as people who lose their livelihoods, often young men, joining terrorist groups, joining illicit groups, just for the sake of finding new livelihoods, right? There's just no other opportunity. And in Lake Chad, this has led to very difficult situations where, for example, in the last years, in average, 1,000 people per year were killed just in these farmer-herder clashes. I'm not talking about all the other developments that are going on there with terrorism and so on, but just 1,000 people per year in farmer-herder clashes, clearly related to water. So I think that's a really challenging situation, but I think also one that just calls for conflict at the local, at the national, but also very much at the transboundary level.
Okay, thank you, Susanne. And we heard from Sonia about the tools and approaches under the convention. So can some of those be sort of used to support the cooperation around the water cooperation in the Lake Chad Basin? And are there some other lessons that you can draw somewhere else?
Yeah, definitely, Antti. I think many of the tools and the approaches that have been developed under the Water Convention and in partnership between the Water Convention and other partners, such as GIZ, the German Development Corporation, for example, can help, first of all, to understand what the linkages are, because they always sound quite simple, right? Water-related stress leads to conflict, but that's obviously not that straightforward. But understanding this is something that is the first step into actually developing policy responses. So that's, for example, something that's being done under the Fraxus project, modeling in a participatory manner with stakeholders at the very local level what drives conflict and what would happen, for example, if a dam's being built, if a new irrigation scheme is being developed. And then taking that to the national and the transboundary level, which is where river basin organizations such as the ABN and the CBLT really come in. And they, of course, benefit then from the support of the Water Convention that has been engaging with the countries there and the basin organizations in looking at the transboundary level. So it's kind of, for me, a two-way system. Approaches that support transboundary cooperation will eventually support the way the basin is managed, which is helping local populations in having hopefully better access to water, but also sharing resources beyond water in this nexus context. And at the same time, very local work on the nexus and the Fraxus being done, ultimately feeding into more cooperative, more peaceful situations at the transboundary level as well.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. I think we're moving quite an interesting basins through, and hopefully you're putting down some questions for the later part of the session, maybe on the Fraxus, if nothing else. We move to Lenka. So Lenka, if I may ask you that, what are some of the challenges that are being addressed jointly in the Orange Sengu Basin?
Yes, thank you very much, and we are quite grateful to be part of this conversation here. Very happy that we were invited. I think when looking at the Orange Sengu Basin, which is in the southern part of the African continent, one should already think through what are some of the issues related to water, and these by and large stem from the availability of the resource, how it is geographically spread out, therefore the scarcity within the river system that we face, which is made worse by the climate impacts that we're expecting. Colleagues who are more scientific in that area are saying it's going to get warmer in our region. Therefore, we have to live up to that. But in addition to that, and because of many historical situations and politics and so on, the use of the river basin has been quite intensive, especially in one of the countries, which is the Republic of South Africa. This river system is shared by Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. And South Africa has been the one that has been utilizing the most of the resource. And this, well, fortunately, because the economy maybe has grown, but unfortunately to some degree, has led to water quality and pollution issues, which are stemming from many impacts to do with industry, impacts to do with historical mining, and impacts to do with irrigation. And maybe to make it even closer to home, the impacts of wastewater treatment facility systems which are not operating so optimally, which also bring in a challenge. But moving to another country which is further upstream in terms of elevation, the Kingdom of Lesotho, one of the challenges there, the biggest one I think, is land degradation. So we are seeing the catchment being affected, gullies developing, and therefore threatening the actual existence of the water resources. At the tail end of the river basin, where the river goes into the ocean, the challenge there is really around water allocation. There is a lot of water storage within the upper sections and the middle sections of the river system, and some of the flows to the lower part of the river system I can say are at risk by and large. And this is not only affecting the economic uses and livelihoods, but it's also affecting the ecological status of the river mouth. Let me stop there for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think you were mentioning there the water allocation as well as one of the challenges. And we'd like to have a bit of a probing question. So can you elaborate on one specific example and what type of measures can be taken on these challenges?
Yes, one can speak of a few measures, but maybe hitting on the water allocation issue to start with, to say that even at the Commission level, this has cropped up from time to time, in that we receive communication from the Secretariat of the Commission about some of the low flows that are experienced in in that area of the river system. And really, the bottom line has to do with the operation of the storage, the operation of the dams. But what we are pursuing, working very closely with the leadership of the water departments in the countries, is to come up with both short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. The short-term solution, or you can also call it a medium-term to some degree, was to agree on a point in the river system through a measurement point or a river gauging station to say how much water should at least be passing this point, especially at the time when it's most needed in this part of the river basin. Therefore, agreeing on that kind of a measure as a short to medium term arrangement, but also working together as a commission, working together with the countries of South Africa and Namibia in this case, who share the river along that stretch, to say that perhaps there is need to build a dam here which can help both in re-regulating the flow to the river mouth, which is an ecologically sensitive area, and also be able to then sustain some of the flows which are required by the irrigation farmers, as well as for livelihoods of the communities living in that area. That's one of the solutions that we are supporting, and through my office we are helping with promoting that kind of a project and also fundraising for that kind of project. I know my colleague is here from Namibia. If the difficult questions come, I'll give her that question very gladly, but I can of course respond. They are my colleagues. Other measures that we are doing, which are more about transparency and maybe drawing other values of or benefits of cooperation, are to do with water quality or river health, we call it, monitoring, where we get all the countries to work together through their officials to go through several points on the river system itself, and actually assess and monitor the water quality in those spots. I know that I've written quite a lot here, but I wouldn't like to take up too much of your time, but I will be led by questions if they arise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lenka. And the microphone keeps on traveling from Southern Africa to Northern America. So to Susanne. Susanne, the climate change and other forces such as population growth have made it and will continue to make some water treaties obsolete. How do we build in or even add-on mechanisms to deal with this challenge? Will you tell about the Northern American experience through the lenses of International Joint Commission?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this year, 2022, is the 113th anniversary of the signing of the Boundary Waters Treaty, the purpose of which was to prevent and resolve disputes between the United States and Canada over the shared waters along the common frontier. The treaty is remarkably simple, clear, short. I brought several copies at the back table. If you'd like to take a look at it. It sets general principles that are to be applied on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't set detailed prescriptions. And these general principles are adaptable and have been able to fit changing issues as they've arisen over time. There are 4 guiding principles there are more than that, but 4 that I'd like to bring to your attention today. One is impartiality. The commission is comprised of 6 members, 3 on the part of the United States, 3 on the part of Canada, appointed at the highest levels of government. We're fortunate to have a Canadian commissioner in the audience today, Ms. Marilyn Fair from Winnipeg. The treaty requires commissioners, before they enter upon their duties of the office, to make a solemn declaration to faithfully and impartially discharge the obligations of the treaty. And it's this principle of impartiality that has led the commission to operate independent from the 2 governments on an arm's length basis. Another general principle that has to do with the way the commission operates is consensus. So the commissioners reach agreement by consensus, and they also encourage their boards, the boards of the commission, to strive to talk until you have a general agreement that is in the interest of both countries. The treaty also required the commission to consider interests. One of the main responsibilities of the commission is to approve projects that use, obstruct, or divert boundary waters. And in approving such projects, they are to consider interests that may be injured on the other side of the line. So when we set conditions for projects, we have to make a suitable and adequate provision for the protection and indemnification of interests that may be harmed. Is interested party. The treaty requires the commission, before making a decision or a finding on a matter before it, to provide a convenient opportunity for interested parties to be heard. So the commission has a very robust public hearing process and public outreach project on any matter that's been referred, and it is these guiding principles that has led the commission to successfully resolve over 120 issues since its establishment, which followed the Boundary Waters Treaty in 1912.
Thank you, Susan. And maybe at this point, I also remind everyone who is listening online that keep on making comments and questions on the chat box, because we keep on monitoring those as well. So you're not excluded from the end discussion or open discussion. But back to you, Susan. So the governance mechanisms must be robust and resilient to cope with the changing climate. So can you bring us some example that how and what type of mechanisms you can have so that there is a certain amount of flexibility involved?
Binational boards is one of the mechanisms for building in flexibility for the treaty. So the treaty is over 100 years old, but it is adaptable. This framework that was set up has been adaptable over time. And I'm going to give an example of such adaptability by featuring one of our binational boards. It's in a beautiful area. It's a Lake of the Woods, Minnesota in the United States, and Manitoba and Ontario in Canada. Just to give you some background, another very signature program of the International Joint Commission is the International Watersheds Initiative. And we've been working on this for over a decade to bring a holistic approach in looking at water levels and flows and ecosystem objectives. In this basin, in the 1930s, the commission was asked to set projects for 2 dams in this basin. And so a board of control was formed to set levels for 2 dams in the system, a water levels and flows board. Then in the 1950s, we were asked to look at water quality in the basin, and a separate board, a water pollution board, was formed. Well, through the International Watershed Initiative, we have been encouraging, well, let's look at this holistically. And in 2013, the board evolved into a watershed board. And that is one of the goals of the commissioners, is to have watershed boards all along the boundary. And I might say how binational boards is a mechanism. We have over 20 boards along the border. These boards are resourced by the commission. They report to the commission twice a year. And it's a form of accountability and a forum for resource agencies, experts, and local members to discuss issues. So the board in 2013 was formed. It also had a wider geographic mandate. It now reports on the entire Lake of the Woods watershed, provides assistance to resource agencies in reporting and managing water quality, and another goal is to have binational water quality objectives. Astounding if the two countries can agree on water quality objectives and carry those out, make their best efforts to carry them out domestically, an astounding mechanism. So here's some pictures. Just this summer, extreme events. Another initiative of the Commission is we're tasking each one of our boards to do an assessment on this a climate change guidance framework. We're asking the boards to look at water levels and to look at their ecosystem and do an assessment of the challenges that may be they may be facing with changing climate. So here you see the meetings that the board has, and there were extreme conditions in the Lake of the Woods this summer, flooding events. They're talking to the public, talking about the flooding. You can see some of the floods, but normally it's a lovely area. So binational boards is really the answer in our experience, is a mechanism for accountability and being able to address issues as they arise.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So adapting to changing climates, you know, a huge challenge, but ways forward on it. So from there, we move towards Australia. So Bradley, could you describe the situation in Australia where indigenous methodologies or cultural flows have been developed to inform water allocation and planning across the Murray-Darling Basin?
That's a great question. I suppose starting from where we're at now, increasing attention has been placed on getting Indigenous people involved in water allocation, but also identifying the values that Indigenous people have. So I'm talking from an Australian point of view, of course, and southeastern Australia, where it's a large river basin. So and we're a colonised country, and there are small states that have access to the basin itself. The basin is 1 million square kilometres, so it's a large basin. It's not across countries, because we're an island country, but it's across states. So there's 5 states and territories are included in that. And within that, there's over 40 autonomous, diverse Aboriginal nations that live and exist within that basin. So I suppose we're intra-continent, so it sort of feels like Australia in the Eurovision. I don't know how we fit in a transboundary scenario. But there was a methodology developed in 2018 over a number of years, and it involved scientists, policy people in government, and obviously Indigenous nations as part of that. And there was 2 case studies developed, and they come up with the cultural flows methodology, and that was heavily based on a New Zealand Māori methodology called Cultural Health Index. So it looked at how people, Māori people, connected with water. So it was more around the taste, feel, smell, look. So more human rather than salinity, pH, suspended solid. So, it was trying to measure the cultural health of the water system. So it came about, and states are encouraged to use it in the Australian context. So it's in a as well as the states, there's also the Commonwealth that sits above the states, and there's a plan called the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and it was more about the challenge of better managing a large river basin and how Indigenous people could be involved. We are still a long way from that point of view, so it is a methodology, and I suppose the cultural flows methodology is very surface water, wetland specific. So there's a wetland on the screen there, and it's a Ramsar site, but Indigenous, that's my country and my countryman up the back, Phil. We go to the same barber. That's our country, and we don't really have a say. So we're only getting access to this country in the last probably 10 years, but we've been locked out for the last 150 because it's been in private tenure. And then obviously the other photo is my nephew and one of the local engagement officers from the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office. You know, I'm taking a photo of her, taking a photo of my nephew, who's trying to look at a small kingfisher, a little blue bird that obviously has fish. He was heavily interested in that bird, and you know that's what I suppose the way we are and Cultural Flows does, is getting people back on country. You know, getting people back on their traditional lands, working with ways to better manage, but also to influence and change the way we look at water and value water. This one isn't groundwater specific. I have another methodology for groundwater, being a hydrogeologist, but you might have to come to the afternoon session to hear about that one.
A bit of a marketing piece at the end as well.
I should add too that the kingfisher is also like a cultural indicator as well. So it's, if you see those small birds on country, that means there's fish around. But if you see the bigger birds, like we have a species that's a larger kingfisher called the kookaburra. You might have heard its laugh. And there's also like high apex predators like sea eagles and wedge-tailed eagles. So if they are around, that means the larger bodied fish are there. But the time I've been there, we haven't seen larger bodied predators because of it hasn't got the right flows, and I suppose Indigenous cultural values can be put into managing this system to actually get these species back.
Yeah, that sounds good. So Bradley, you have literally a global audience. So I wonder that what could the Indigenous people around the world actually really learn from the Australian experience? How would you share it?
Yeah, that's, I suppose, having the microphone to a global audience is a great honour, and I'm not going to sing like in Eurovision, but I'm going to talk about water. I think there is a lot to learn from the Australian experience. We're an old culture, 60,000+ years of existence on the continent, but we believe we come from the Dreamtime. So, you know, from day one was the Dreamtime, and we've been there since forever. So, lucky my kids aren't in the room, because I say I've been involved in water for 65,000 years, which is a fair time. But I think the challenge is learn from, I suppose, our mistakes on how we've, you know, come to the table. And, you know, I have a global audience now, and, you know, that's a great opportunity to express that, you know, we're moving forward, but it's slow. It's very slow. And other continents and other countries have obviously moved forward in some spaces. And I think there's an opportunity. The learnings I want to give to you is to make sure that Indigenous people are involved up front in, you know, part of the process. So it's, you know, it's co-designed, co-led, and then ultimately co-delivered, and then, you know, you have the monitoring and evaluation of that delivery, and you can see changes in the landscape, because Australia, in Western terms, is only a young country, 234 years, but the ancientness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, you know, is 60,000+ years. I think there's some new evidence coming out that the Southern Australia, there's some 80,000-year-old evidence of occupation. So, you know, we've been there a long time. It's the driest inhabited continent on Earth, and we are ready to be there. So I suppose it's 234 years of, let's say, mismanagement. We might need a 234-year recovery plan to get it back to health. We're here ready. We're not going anywhere. You know, we had 2 severe droughts in the last 20 years. So we had a thing called the Millennium Drought, sort of the turn of the century. Sounds a long time ago. It was only 1999, but we had a Millennium Drought, and then there was a bit of rain, and then we had another drought. And so they were 2 worst on record droughts consecutively. And in 2018-19, there was huge fish kills in one of our rivers. And so that river was a is sacred to those people, the Barkindji people. And, you know, there was big-bodied old fish floating belly up because there was no oxygen in the water and there was blue-green algal blooms. But they didn't get a say in its management. So they want to be there. And I think that's the thing I'm putting out there, is that Indigenous people have a strong connection. They have a cultural obligation to care for their lands. And I think we're here to bang the table, to say we're here, we're ready to give advice as well, you know. So it's a long journey, but yeah, as I said, we're in it for the long haul. We want to see healthy rivers, healthy people, healthy aquifers.
Yeah, thank you, Bradley. And I have to say that, you know, when we first met today here, it took like 2 minutes, and we were discussing about the Sami people, who are the indigenous population in the northern part of Scandinavia. So, you know, the kingfisher then connecting our continents, and in the topics that we work on the water and the water allocation. But, you know, thank you. I think it's a time of applause to everyone. So, this might have been the easy part of the session, but the other one is the scary part, because you don't know what to expect. And I'm sure that there is questions coming from the floor or online. And if not, then the panelists may be starting asking questions from you. So is there anyone who would like to go? I think there was the gentleman here who had the hand up first.
Hello, this is our question.
We need to have mic. Let's move the mic.
This is a question for all the panelists. I'm Stefano. I work for WWF in the Mekong region. We have a lot of transboundary rivers. They are very complicated dynamics and context. And I would like to hear from you, based on your success and experiences, what was the main barriers to get everyone on the table and eventually to get them to sign those agreements and give up on, I would say, certain powers and privileges. Thank you.
I suppose this is not for Susan, because it was 139 or something years ago, but who would like to give it a go?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, because in our case, there weren't really major obstacles. I think it was a coalescence of interest and the right kind of, I would say, conditions that combined to enable this agreement. So there was the, I wouldn't say pressure, but stimulus from the international community, and very exact needs, very concrete needs by all the countries. In this case, it was navigational purposes, because this river used to run through one country, and suddenly you had 6 borders on it. So you needed, you had a specific need to address. So actually, the international community kind of paved the way, but then they saw that the technical level was actually quite capable of, continuing the negotiations, and they concluded these technical negotiations in 9 months. And when they submitted it to their ministers, they didn't change a dot. So I think it was a combination of kind of, all the conditions being, ripe for such an agreement. So I'm not aware of major obstacles. Of course, there was a lot of, suspicion, because these were warring parties until just a few years back. But these, technical people, they knew each other from before. They used to work together. So I think this technical cooperation was really, a great trust builder that then, convinced the ministers that they made a good deal.
Yeah, so maybe just to mention that after the Second World War, Finland was also in the situation where we had to agree with our neighbors on the transboundary water cooperation issues, and it took something like 15-20 years to get the agreements in place in a post-war situation. So it's a long process, and I think it's fair to mention here as well that there's 2 sides. The one being that for the diplomacy part that needs to precede the transboundary water cooperation. So you can't just switch the cooperation on from the light switch. There has to be a political process that precedes and really builds the trust between the parties to have it happening. Lenka.
Yes, I think maybe continue in the same kind of line, and to say that maybe in Southern Africa, what preceded was even longer. Because if you look at the population groups found in these countries I mentioned, and maybe even broader, what we call SADC, we are speaking historically, culturally, language and all that. The relations were already there. The separations were brought in by the demarcation of boundaries. So it was really natural for the countries to work together. And even when you look at some of the challenges, and maybe stretching it to even the topics of economics, and you look at the kind of infrastructure we need, those small economies, I call them small because I'm from there, those small economies individually cannot solve some of the problems that they have by building the kinds of storages that are required to generate the power, to provide the amounts of waters, access, and so on and so forth. So I think the interdependency is something that came, that was realized later on, maybe, that we are so interdependent, we have to work together. And also the economies of scale are being taken advantage of, but the relationships were already there. And this is where I would just like to say, so maybe I'm not saying what impediments we had, but I'm just giving you the kind of opportunities that were already there. Thank you.
Yeah, and Susan continues.
Just to quickly add, because we've heard a lot of very positive examples now, which I think is great and inspiring. But if we look at the Lake Chad and the Niger Basin, for example, there it was the sheer necessity to pool resources to develop the water resources when in 1964 the Lake Chad Basin Commission and then 1980 the Niger Basin Authority was established. So it was the inability of the countries individually to develop their water resources that brought them together. What's interesting though is that with that they established a platform for cooperation that's now available as other challenges hit, such as water scarcity, such as climate change and the conflicts that come from it. And now I think it really pays off having these platforms established in order to address all the newly emerging challenges, a bit similar to what we heard for the US-Canada example.
I think that's also quite an interesting thought, because then it also might be that there is a certain point in time after which it's much more difficult to agree on anything. Other questions?
My question is about the International Convention and how... Sorry?
Maybe you stand up and...
I'm sorry. My question is about the International Convention and just how are the international commissioners appointed?
On the United States side, they're appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. So they're the highest level of government. And likewise, in Canada, they're appointed at the highest level of government. So, and Marilyn might be able to say more, but I believe that they're recommended by the minister, but they're a cabinet appointment.
The process in Canada recently changed.
Can you speak up?
The process in Canada recently changed with the new Prime Minister, who opened up these kind of appointments for people to apply just directly online. Actually, a very democratizing process for these positions, which were normally really politically appointed previously to that. And so that you would go through a selection process and an interview with the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office and all those high-level folks, and then ultimately somewhere in those hallowed halls somebody makes a decision that somebody is appointed. And I think it's an extremely complex process in the US also, many levels of vetting, et cetera.
And then I'm drawing a little bit back on the tools and approaches. We were getting the discussion also on the water allocation handbook. So we have several organizations in-house who were part of a long time with the preparation of it. So is there anyone who would like to sort of open up, like how do you see the value of you engaging with the preparation of the book? Or maybe I think there was one hand in the back. No? Okay, well, let's take another question.
Thank you. Anton Earl, Director of CIWI's Africa Regional Center in Pretoria. I find it fascinating hearing from different basin organizations like this. You're hearing one between Canada, the United States, and Tati Lenka speaking about Orasacom. And it strikes me that so many of the things, a lot is similar in how you operate, but something that both of you said was actually very different. And Tati, you speak there about working in close collaboration with the national governments and the relationship you have there. And the IJC, it sounded like you said something about it being an arm's length relationship. So very sort of intentional in keeping that distance. I'd be interested to hear why it is different like that. Does it play out differently? Is that by design, or is it just grown that way? Thank you.
In my experience, that is truly one of the reasons for the IJC's success is its independence. And we say this all the time in even our appointment letters to board members. We let them know you will not be representing your government agency while you're sitting on our binational board. We say you're operating in your personal and professional capacity. You put on your IJC hat and you take off your government hat. We do not have the commissioners themselves. They do not espouse the positions of the government. And I think that brings credibility, neutrality, trustworthiness to the decisions of the commission. So that, without a doubt, is one of the reasons for the success, that independence.
Yeah. Yeah, Anton, and you know, I would say this: I don't regard it as a success or not a success. It's a complicated question, because these things are deliberate and at the same time not deliberate. Because, as you know, I'm saying about you now, the arrangement for establishing basin agreements or basin organizations in Southern Africa was adopted at a regional level. To start. So the countries of Southern Africa decided deliberately that we are going to be working together on rivers that we share in this manner. The second point, which is probably important, is the fact that when you sit in those commissions, you are representing your country as an authority. In other words, you are drawing the mandate of the country, the sovereignty and so on, and you are bringing it onto the table with your neighbors that you share the water with. Of course, there is the other added element. Maybe it has to do with our economics and so on. The fact that these river basin organizations wouldn't exist without this financial support of the governments. So in our case, that is the chain of linkages. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take over there.
Thank you very much. I'm called Emmanuel Adu-Parmenas from the Republic of South Sudan. We know that water quality, environmental degradation is going to continue. Within the basins, have we thought of finding other alternative sources of water? Because one time, I don't know whether I was dreaming, I heard over a radio that South Africa was considering mining ice and bring fresh water to South Africa. Has that materialized? Is it being worked on? If it succeeds, will it be used by other countries like Egypt and so on? Because sometimes we feel that we're getting a lot of pressure from downstream countries for more water allocation, and what are we going to do in that regard? So that also we have the privilege to utilize that water in order to allow for environmental recovery. Thank you.
Even Anton could take this one. They didn't drag the ice block from the Antarctic. Yeah, that was the idea, that you drag a block of ice from the Antarctic, bring it to Cape Town, melt it, and so on. They didn't do that. I think let's leave it to the scientists to work on that kind of arrangement a bit further. But I think rivers are still dependable, and then maybe we go to groundwater and then maybe we can think about desalination. But for now, I think the cooperation between the countries still provides a cheaper solution, so to speak, in our region. It's just the cooperation itself that needs to be maintained, so to speak.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's fair to say that to colleague from South Sudan that I suppose when the situation in coming decades and maybe centuries comes more and more complicated, then the more innovative and let's say more desperate solutions are tried to be found. And even though how far-fetched it might feel now, we don't know where this world is actually moving. So we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Amy Newsock. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. One aspect that I'm not hearing yet is the role of technology and the means to actually visualize, using technology to visualize the many trade-offs that cooperation at the transboundary level has to evaluate and requires. I'm curious if anyone can speak to a good example or a vision for how you would incorporate technology and call out maybe some of our technology companies who have joined us this year, like Google and Microsoft, to play a role in that, to help us leapfrog some of what is inherently slow in a cooperation process, and also incorporate scenarios of climate change to be able to create that flexibility as we make these decisions across trade-offs over time.
Anyone? I'll give it to Susanne, but I'm also wondering if Bradley have anything on this. But let's start with Susanne, you?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I think especially you, Antti, you said earlier, it's the diplomats that have to be brought in as well to agree to cooperation. And I think in that case, it's super helpful to have technology to visualize what's the situation now, what it's going to be the situation in the future, and why cooperation might be needed, even if it doesn't seem to fit into current national considerations of security or whatever. And I can give you maybe one example. In this cooperation of the Water, Peace and Security Partnership with others, we have developed dashboards, tools where we can work with the very local population, but also with national governments to actually visualize what if, for example, in the inner Niger Delta, Foamy Dam is being built upstream, the climate change effects will be of this and this magnitude, or the irrigation scheme of the Office du Niger is expanding further. And that has really helped people to understand what the implications would be, but also to model sort of different future scenarios and identify the low-hanging fruits for cooperation. We're indeed also engaging with Google, working on it was just released in a publication, a new project that helped us model small and medium reservoirs and the levels of these reservoirs, something that's often actually overlooked. Like we talk about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, we talk about Rogun Dam, but quite often you also have transboundary effects, especially in a cumulative manner, that come from smaller and medium-sized reservoirs. And that's also something that countries not always like to share information on. So I do think that also engaging with new technologies, we're also sort of leveling the playing field between different countries that might have more or less technical capacity, but that might also disagree on sort of information we have on a basin. But I think in the end, there's still the challenge that data remains very political, and it's difficult to feed it into the policy processes, even with better tools such as dashboards, and make it credible or make it understood by the water diplomats. Bradley, do you want to add?
Yeah, I suppose initially I thought that's part of our challenge as well, is technology is part of the problem sometimes as well. So, but I think looking at from an Indigenous point of view, like there are opportunities. So that I mentioned the cultural flows research. There was two case studies. So one was actually a delivered flow of water based on cultural values, and the other one was a modelled flow. So it was a very dry part of the country, and it was actually purely modelled. So there was no water delivered, but they actually measured how much water their culturally significant site needed. So then if there is an opportunity to deliver water, they know exactly the amount of megalitres they need to put into that system. There are other opportunities, like I know a lot of agencies in Australia collect a lot of data and like Western scientific data, and I think there's an opportunity, especially at home, is to work with new data and work with old data, which is Indigenous knowledge. So bringing that two-way like two-way science together. I think there's a great opportunity there. You know, there's not many Indigenous scientists that we don't seem to go that pathway, but our elders have the knowledge base that can actually engage in some of that. You know, an example is modelling through LiDAR the deep water holes that were left in the last drought. And so those deep water holes would be culturally significant because they're the places that would be sung about, would be danced about, would be told in stories that people would go to and know where to go when the country is dry and in drought. So, or at the moment, you know, we're under La Nina at the moment, so it's very wet. And so we've gone through a number of, and you know, like our old people would have known because we have a bird species, a flightless bird called the emu, and it would be breeding, it only breeds once a year, and we have sky stories in the Milky Way and in the stars that tell us when to hunt and when to actually go and collect emu eggs. So they're about that big, and they make a mega omelette, so they're beautiful. But the knowledge of our old people would have said we're under a different climate at the moment because the emus are breeding throughout. They're not just breeding the once. So that old knowledge can hopefully come with new knowledge and new data where it can actually manage it better. That's the dream anyway.
No, I do like the idea that thinking that we cannot just rely on upcoming new technologies, but also combining with the traditional knowledge and skills. And I do want to touch upon one of the things Susanne was mentioning, a huge dam being built somewhere in Africa, and you know, not really going into details of the question that's particular case, but you know, if the parties debate about how much is being filled, or is there not cracks in the saddle dam or whatever, for international community, it's actually quite easy to know what is the reality. So satellite imagery in a matter of days can provide us information that what is the reality of different parts of the structure. So I think we are in a different age now than we were 20 or 30 years ago, when in the political negotiations one way or the other way could be said as a truth. We have a question there in the back, I think. So please guide me. Which area of the room have I neglected so far mostly? Yeah.
Morning everyone. My name is Blake. I'm a journalist from South Africa. So my question is Southern African based. Southern Africa as a region by nature is very diverse, be it linguistically, demographically, culturally, geographically, you name it. Yet somehow the Southern African development community remains a shining light of transboundary cooperation. So what do you think might be the main driving force behind the negation of these obstacles to enhance transboundary cooperation? Is it perhaps the naturally semi-arid nature of the Southern African region, where water is so desperately needed that you're almost forced to negate any differences to work together for the betterment of your people?
Do we have any other answers than one coming from Lenka? I don't know, maybe we could also try to get some views through the other basins as well.
The thing is, he has already answered the question. Yes, I think the level of, let's call it desperation today, the level of desperation in our region in terms of where the water exists and where the needs are, and you know, things like what I was mentioning about the economies. You look at the Kingdom of Lesotho, is well endowed in water because of where it sits and the precipitation it receives. We say precipitation in Lesotho because we receive snow as well. So those kinds of scenarios. On the other side, you have an economy which is too small to build some of the storages that are required. So the countries are bound to work together, but you have to recognize the interdependencies which are there. Lesotho depends on its neighboring countries for other things, well, employment and other matters, let me say, to be exact. And then you have the possibility of building the dams to supply some of the highest demands in Southern Africa within that space, in a country which is very low in terms of its economy. So some of these elements, I think, are very important. And you look at the politics and the history as well. Even the politics of Southern Africa are such that the countries, Namibia, my sister coming from Namibia, the Zimbabwe, my brother coming from Zimbabwe, these countries have worked together even in politics in the recent past. So the whole idea of cooperating to address a challenge which is global in nature, like water, access to water and so on, was to me very natural. Maybe it's not an accident, let me say. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, and this also kind of addresses the Mekong. One thing that brings you to the table is if you're not always the upstream interest. And with the United States and Canada, we are both upstream and downstream, depending on where you are. Example, where U.S. is the downstream, receives polluting waters on Poplar River. We're the upstream country on the Red River. So that seems to really. You have to work it out because, and you have that knowledge that, well, they may have the upper hand in one place, but we can get them somewhere else, right? So you kind of are forced to it if you're not solely either upstream or downstream.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking at the time, and I realize that we need to start wrapping up, unless there is something really a burning question. But we agreed with the panelists that we have a sort of a final 2-sentence takeaway, or what do you capture from the discussion from your own point of view? And I might like to start with Tanya.
Thank you. I think what, from the different experiences of the different basins we've heard today, I think we build a strong case for the value of transboundary cooperation, especially I think for upstream countries that are sometimes reluctant to engage in this kind of cooperation or join the water conventions. I think we all attest to the value of this cooperation and joining the conventions. Thank you.
Well, as a Finn, I start to smile. So Finland is a strong supporter of the convention, and we are upstream country to our eastern neighbor. Okay, we go this way around.
I think there's a great opportunity to have a look at Australia. Like as I mentioned earlier, we are a dry continent, 70% semi-arid, and there are arid parts of the country where it receives very little rain at all. We're experiencing climate change right now. I should have mentioned the photos. So there was 2 photos I had in my second question, and that was between 2 months. So it's hotter and drier. So we're experiencing that, and like Indigenous knowledge is there for the opportunity for ways of looking differently at how we value water as well. So if we value water as the essence of life, and my old people say, without it you die. So it's pretty important. And I think but in a Western paradigm, it's viewed as a dollar value. And once you put that dollar value on, all the other aspects come into play, and we're right at that moment now where too much water is coming out of the system, and if you have that water allocation, you have a lot of power, and we don't have a lot of power.
Thank you. While you're off. Yeah. Susan.
Yeah, I don't have concluding remarks prepared. I wanted to know what's happening, and it's really difficult because it was a very rich and diverse discussion. But what I think was very positive was that other than many transboundary sessions that we usually have at water conferences, it actually had a very positive spirit, right? Normally these transboundary sessions are quite daunting, and it's all about conflict and endless negotiations and so on. So I was quite happy to hear that, and I think it was probably because we've opened the box quite a bit. I mean, we talked about technology, we talked about how close or far away you should be from the government, we brought in the indigenous knowledge. We heard from some really good examples around the world, really positive ones, obviously. So maybe that's the way forward, to stop the daunting, gloomy perspective on transboundary and really think a bit out of the box. That's what I hope.
To Lenka. May I, in between, I just wanted, for my own record, please raise your hand if you come from the Foreign Service, from the Foreign Ministry or Foreign Service. In the back row. So, okay, next year you're in the front row, okay? Because I think this is great. We had maybe a 10 hands coming up, and when I asked the same question 3-4 years ago, we had like one hand coming up. And you know, with this topic, you know, we need to have both sides, water and the foreign policy. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, in my case, really, I just think one feels a lot more inspired and full of hope. This is a long journeys all the time, but I think maybe one is beginning to realize that we are probably on a useful path, and maybe let us just work together, and that is all. Thank you.
Together.
I agree with all the panelists here, and I think we all mentioned how important it is to adaptively manage the system. We need technology, and we try to get the best that we can, and we provide the forum, a neutral forum. We bring the players, the governments, the resources to bear to talk about issues, and we just got to keep talking, and that'll lead to a better place.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we give a little bit of hand. Thank you, and I still move it to Sonia for you for a couple of words at the end.
Thanks a lot. I think there's not very much to add to what has been said. The need indeed to go outside of the box. Us as Transboundary community, we've heard about the need to also consider indigenous and local communities in Transboundary water cooperation. The need to consider new technologies, but to combine them with what already exists on the ground. The need to adapt existing agreements to the new changes such as climate change, but also population growth and others. And to develop new agreements in such a way from the beginning. And here, in order to do all this, we need strong basin organizations, because basin organizations are the ones which bring together countries and which can help the countries to address those new challenges, like binational boards, by transboundary cooperation at bilateral level, transboundary cooperation at basin level, also at regional level, such as in the SADC framework, but also at other in other frameworks. And this is also where the Water Convention plays a crucial role, exactly in order to bring together those experiences from across the world, to enable learning and sharing of experiences, to enable putting transboundary cooperation higher on the global agenda. If I think 10, 15 years back, I think transboundary cooperation session wouldn't have seen such an audience like we had here today. So I think we have already achieved a lot, but we can and must achieve much more towards the conference next year. So I hand back the floor to my colleague Remy to speak about some of the next steps, but also invite you to some of the upcoming events on the Water Convention, where we continue some of those discussions, such as on climate change in October, or in the source to sea management in December. No.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I just wanted to end by reminding everybody that we've been talking about different tools and approaches. It was great on a personal level to see so many people here who are involved in the production of the Water Allocation Handbook and who have case studies and other elements of the handbook that they have been a part of. So the resources are on our program page. So you can find all the links there, and you can also find them at our respective organisational or national websites to follow up there. So if you have any questions, please reach out. We're always available to share additional resources with you. And I'd just like to again thank to all the partners and all the individual panellists. Fantastic moderation by Antti, fantastic presentation by Sonia, and also to all of you and everybody online who made a great participation. So thank you. Have a great rest of the week.